It was supposed to be over. Kratos, the once great Spartan captain, now the terrifying ghost of Sparta, was supposed to be done. He overcame his bond to an increasingly power-hungry Ares. He faithfully served the rest of the Pantheon for 10 years. He performed miracle after miracle, request after request. He has saved the world and butchered all who would stop his march. None who stood against him, and the gods he was following, could stop him. His servitude culminated in a task no mortal could ever accomplish: the death of a son of Zeus. The death of the god who sent Kratos on this path of servitude. The death of the insane god of war who only sought near constant chaos and bloodshed. The death of Ares. It was supposed to be over. The nightmares that haunted Kratos, the sin of murdering his wife and his daughter, were supposed to be erased from his head. It was supposed to be done, but the gods are never so kind. Forgiven for his crimes, Kratos recognized the folly of how he had wasted the past 10 years, and sought to end himself by his own hand, without future and without hope. It was supposed to be over. He cast himself off the highest mountain in all of Greece, the site of his greatest battle. But the gods are never so kind. For his final act under their servitude, Kratos was granted ascension. A mortal became a god. A throne he had emptied was now his for the taking. It was supposed to be done. It was only just beginning. Kratos did not sit easy in his new seat of power. Following the events of the original PlayStation 2 God of War video game, the new God of War sets out on a journey to secure his throne by questing for the fabled Ambrosia of Asclepius, a talisman capable of wondrous healing. This quest is not covered in any God of War game, rather the 6-issue comic book series God of War. A lot of the stuff in the franchise is just named God of War, which is somewhat confusing. The first issue, released March 2010, with subsequent issues coming out on a bi-monthly schedule. Issue 2, released May 2010. Issue 3, July 2010. The next 2 issues would see releases in September and November of 2010, respectively. The final issue released in January of 2011. The series was written by Marv Wolfman, prolific comic book writer responsible for, among many things, the co-creation alongside Gene Colan of the Marvel character Blade, and the writing of DC's Crisis on Infinite Earths storyline, with writer and artist George Perez. God of War cover art was done by Andy Park, who was also a concept artist for God of War 2, God of War Chains of Olympus, and God of War 3, not counting the 13 different Marvel Cinematic Universe projects he was also a concept artist of, and was artist for a whole slew of comics from the mid-90s to late 2010s. Penciling was done mainly by Joao Bosco de Souza, whose other work includes penciling Nightwing comics. Inking the illustrations was done by Andrea Sorrentino, God of War being his first published work before working in various DC, Marvel, and Image comics. Lettering was done by Saida Abbott, editing by Ben Abernathy, and Kristy Quinn is listed as assistant. Full list of credits for God of War are in the links below. God of War was published throughout 2010 by the company Wildstorm. Founded by Jim Lee and Brandon Choi in 1992, God of War issues 1 through 5 would be among the last issues the company would initially publish following a 1998 acquisition by DC Comics that made Wildstorm an imprint of DC, meaning that both the comic universes were allowed to coexist and original characters from both companies would be allowed to appear in each other's works. Due to DC's upcoming plans to relaunch their entire universe through their New 52 initiative, Wildstorm was shut down December of 2010. The company's characters were incorporated into the relaunch, and in 2017, Wildstorm would officially be revived. As for God of War's final issue, that was still released on schedule in January of 2011, as mentioned previously, but this final issue was published by DC Comics as opposed to Wildstorm. The paperback collecting the whole series was released March 2011 to coincide with the God of War 3 release that same month. The God of War comics were one of 5 stories designed to fill in the gaps of the saga of Kratos beyond the initial trilogy. These comics depict Kratos' hunt for the Ambrosia of Asclepius at 2 key points of his life: immediately following the birth of his daughter Calliope, and again after he became the new God of War. As the comic spends most of its time in flashback during Kratos' first quest for the Ambrosia, we're going to discuss that first. And really, this means discussing the nature of the gods. The enduring nature of Greek mythology and its themes in our modern culture come from how gods were perceived by the Greeks, that being, the gods were made in the image of humans. Deities with human qualities living in their perfect kingdom, powerful beings in a supposed utopia, equals boredom. Bored is the worst thing a god can be in a Greek myth. The common catalyst for so many of the myths, actually. Bored means getting into fights with other gods that could result in wars or several other kinds of conflicts. Bored means gods falling prey to their worst human tendencies like jealousy, like cruelty, like irrationality. Bored means passing the time with wagers about erecting statues and garnering praise. Kratos' quest for the Ambrosia of Asclepius is born from a wager between Ares, Hades, Poseidon, Hermes, Artemis, and Helios. Many of these gods looking as they do in God of War 3, which is a great stylistic choice. In Kratos' early days, we peek into additional aspects of Spartan culture, wherein Kratos garners praise and adoration across Sparta for his skill and his prowess, even at a young age. He meets, falls in love with, and begins a family with Lysandra of Sparta. And it's through their daughter Calliope's birth we see a prime example of the gods at their worst. You see, the godly wager is a race for the fabled Ambrosia of Asclepius. The winner gets statues of them erected across Greece, so hooray for them. Now, the fabled Ambrosia of Asclepius is a healing tonic that betters all it touches. But it would be boring and probably somewhat demeaning for gods to race for a talisman that personally holds zero benefit to them. They need mortal champions to fight in their name, and to do so with real stakes so as to make the wager actually interesting for them. And since much of the suffering that befalls man is at the hands of the gods, they need to be the one to actually generate those stakes and sense of urgency for a truly exciting race. Hooray! All this to say, Ares cursed Calliope with disease at her birth, knowing that Spartan law dictates diseased or weak infants are to be hurled into the chasm of Mount Taygetos to die. Kratos is told of the legendary Ambrosia, sells the other Spartan soldiers and his king on the benefits that this gift of Asclepius would have not only for Calliope, but for all of Sparta, and that was that. Kratos unknowingly became Ares' chosen champion for a stupid wager. The race was on. Ares couldn't stop screwing with Kratos even at the very beginning. Even long before the events of the first game, Ares already had his claws in Kratos, and as we'll be seeing in further adventures and further stories, it goes even deeper than that. Back to the comic, however, that's all basically issue 1. From here, The flashback story of the comic falls into the formula of essentially every issue Kratos facing one of the other gods as champions in a desperate bid for the Ambrosia. Issue 2, for example, sees Kratos and his Spartans take on Herodias of Thera, who is Poseidon's champion. Herodias seeks the Ambrosia after Poseidon sent a deadly plague to his island, and as you'd expect, they fight, and Kratos wins, because of course he does. And Poseidon's pissed, not for the last time either. Issue 3 features Artemis's champion, Pothia, falling to Kratos. Issue 4 sees the future Ghost of Sparta overcome Helios' champion, whose name I only know from the wiki is Sarion. The comic does almost nothing with most of these champions, which is disappointing. They are basically just one step above nameless mooks to give Kratos something to fight for the majority of the story that makes sense for the point in time we're in right now. Most of them don't get great build-up prior to their fight, and only one, what's his name, Helios' champion, has actually a cool demigod power of fire associated to make the fight, a more visual spectacle. You'll notice that so far I left out Hades and Hermes' champion. Danaus, Hermes' champion, is so unimportant that Kratos never even meets him in the story before he's killed. Hades' champion, on the other hand, is the barbarian prince Ulrich, and if the word barbarian is triggering any first game flashbacks, that's not a coincidence. This comic explores hidden backstory from a previously unnamed character and the origins of a rivalry fated to ruin Kratos' life. It was actually Hades' fault, an unintended consequence of his sore loser mentality on this stupid wager, that Kratos was pushed into a position to make his deal with Ares in the first place. Hades not only chose Ulrich as his champion, cursing Ulrich's father with a very terrible illness to ensure his drive and urgency for the wager, of course, but following his confrontations with Kratos in issues 5 and 6, confrontations that show off Ulrich's incredible formidability even this early on, Hades makes a point of resurrecting Ulrich, not through the Ambrosia, which Kratos stole back from Ulrich after losing it in their first battle, and which they both end up using accidentally on each other as they fight. Not all of it, though. But he does so with his own godly powers, fueled through petulance over losing the wager to Ares. Hades allows Ulrich to live and encourages Ulrich's need for vengeance against the Spartan following his father's death. A need for vengeance that is fated to end with Ulrich himself dead and Kratos a slave. But despite all that, Kratos does recover the Ambrosia. He returns to Sparta just in time to save his daughter from an early grave and achieve a happy ending for his family, his king, and his nation, for now, anyway. This is actually a great time to quickly discuss what is universally agreed to be the weakest aspect of the comic, which is the artwork. I have mixed opinions on it overall. There are certain splash pages and large panels depicting grand, large-scale battles that look absolutely incredible. Scenes in the day or with sources of bright light also shine as highlight moments. On the other hand, smaller scenes, personal moments, dark environments, and rain tend to lend towards the overall muddy impression that most who look at the issues don't tend to like. This isn't an issue with the covers, which they all look fantastic. This is a problem with the interior artwork. I tend to lean with majority opinion on this. The majority of the comic is quite difficult to look at. It's purely my interest in God of War that kept me going on the first reading of the series all those years ago. This, my second reading, was fueled almost entirely by the want to complete this new God of War YouTube project I'm in the middle of. If it weren't for the YouTube factor, I'd have never read through this series again. It's truly difficult to look at and understand what you're seeing for parts of it. Here's an interesting fact though. This art style was used again a few years later for the God of War Ascension prequel and multiplayer tie-in comic, Rise of the Warrior. It's likely no coincidence that a majority of that story was better lit, making it clearer what's happening to who and where, making for a less muddy reading experience overall. Let's jump back into the story though, because we've only brushed on the first half of it. Following his unwitting ascension to godhood, Kratos retraced his first journey for the Ambrosia of Asclepius, intent on finding it again. The present-day story is much shorter, comprising approximately 25% of the comic overall, and acts as a framing device for the flashbacks, which is another disappointing decision in my opinion. I find Kratos' life post becoming a god to be just as fascinating as his early days, and would have appreciated a closer 50-50 split on the storylines that we're following here. This may potentially be due to the development of God of War Goes to Sparta. That game would release November of 2010, and there's no proof of this of course, but perhaps in an effort to keep the overall canon protected, the comic team may have been given guidelines on just how much they could cover in the nebulous time between the events of God of War and Goes to Sparta without stepping on the game's toes, as it too covers aspects of Kratos' past that were previously unknown and tense moments during his tenure as the God of War before we get to the events of God of War 2. Again, there's no proof that I know of, but considering how little of the comic is set in present day, it certainly feels like it. The present day story also acts as an epilogue and continuation to the original God of War, unveiling a storyline that is pretty directly connected to the events of that game. Kratos seeks the Ambrosia the second time, not to use it, not to hoard it, he wants to destroy it outright this time. Kratos is worried any remaining followers of Ares could use the Ambrosia in a ritual to resurrect the fallen god of war. Kratos has already killed Ares. He doesn't need or want to do it again. Kratos follows the path from his first journey a lifetime ago, battling hordes of dangerous creatures that would feel right at home in the original God of War, including a giant spider and a mob of his dead Spartan companions that he had abandoned in his first quest when Ulrich was escaping with the Ambrosia in issue 5. The second quest allows for the consequences of Kratos' choices from his first quest to come back and act as obstacles. If the stories were split closer to 50-50, I think this would be a lot more interesting. As it stands, it's possible you may not immediately connect. For example, the undead soldiers at the end of issue 4, being born from a decision that Kratos made in a flashback in issue 5 to abandon them in the first place. I didn't connect the dots, not the first time I read this anyway. The second time I was able to more clearly understand what was happening. Again, not helped by the artwork all that much. Amongst these various encounters, Athena arrives in issue 3, warning him that enemies that could even pose a danger to a god lie in wait on the path to the Ambrosia after what happened last time. It's never made explicitly clear who sent the giant spider or resurrected the Spartans or placed the other creatures and dangers between Kratos and the spire of Asclepius, though in my personal opinion it wouldn't be a stretch to assume a combination of Hades, still very bitter about Ulrich and Persephone, and unnamed followers of Ares, who are briefly talked about in the last issue, more on them later, are responsible for all of these dangers in Kratos' path. Again, a better split between the flashback and present-day plots would help give this stuff time to breathe. Kratos' encounter with the goddess of war and wisdom also unintentionally invoked a scene from the future, which I thought was pretty cool when I spotted it. Anyway, Kratos returns to the cave within the spire, housing the remains of a tiny little island holding a still intact Ambrosia tree. Ulrich and Kratos battle to the bitter end and essentially ended up killing each other over the Ambrosia last time. The only reason they were both still alive after that battle was because they used some of the Ambrosia on themselves. There shouldn't be any left now. However, Kratos suspected the tree he had plucked the Ambrosia from in the first place was the true source of the healing powers. And sure enough, Kratos' battle with Helios' hot-headed champion from last time burned everything on that island to a crisp except for the Ambrosia tree, because the Ambrosia tree is the true source of the healing powers, and thus it just healed itself. To destroy the Ambrosia, Kratos would need to destroy this tree. Just before he can do that, though, the final boss, quote-unquote, of the comic pops up. The island was no island at all. It was a Hecatoncheires. Gyges, son of Uranos, the brother of Aegean from God of War Ascension, and Kotis, a Hecatoncheires that Kratos will never meet. Gyges reveals the Ambrosia perched atop his body was being used by him to slowly reawaken himself from his slumber, something Kratos unknowingly slowed down in his battle with Sarion and subsequent taking of the Ambrosia that the tree had produced. However, as the tree was the source of the Ambrosia, Gyges was able to just keep waiting patiently, waiting for more Ambrosia to be produced and continue his reawakening process. With Kratos now there, Gyges hopes to simply kill him to prevent his Ambrosia source from being destroyed and also taking revenge on the Ghost of Sparta for hurting him so much last time. Gyges wishes to find and reawaken his brothers to achieve world domination as Gyges believes that he and his brothers, the three Hecatoncheires, are the rightful heirs to Ouranos' world, not the Titans, not the gods. Cue epic boss battle, similar in scale to Kratos versus the Fury-controlled Aegean back in God of War Ascension. Correctly deducing Gyges' weakness to be fire, Kratos calls upon Apollo's Flame, which is the narrative's magic upgrade that's given to Kratos in Issue 1 on his first quest by a mysterious healer that many deduce to be Zeus in disguise. Using this flame, Gyges and the Ambrosia are destroyed, and our narrator declares this action will anger the followers of Ares into acting against Kratos. And they will. Kinda. It's an ending written in 2010 when God of War 3 was coming out and Ghost of Sparta was to be released less than a year later. This is not a plotline that goes anywhere in the grand scheme of the series, and the fact that it was added to the ending is another knock against the series overall. In becoming the new God of War, it might have been assumed Kratos' adventures were over. But our journey through the Greek saga demonstrates Kratos' ascension is merely one step of a larger journey. Kratos still has enemies. Some have already fallen. Some await a new opportunity for revenge. Some, meanwhile, have simply not been revealed to him yet. The God of War comic is an interesting read, but I would only truly recommend it for those curious and already fans of the God of War franchise as a whole. The at times confusing art direction, uneven focus between flashback and present day, and introduction of stories that are destined to go nowhere make this a tough sell on its own. As an interlude chapter in a larger story, I ultimately enjoyed it, but I'm in no rush to pick this one up again. Next time, we further explore the adventures of Kratos as a god. When visions force the Ghost of Sparta to confront a dark chapter of his past, the rest of the Pantheon thinks should be left alone. And by the end, Kratos' ultimate fate may be set in stone. The saga will continue in God of War, Ghost of Sparta. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye-bye.